Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you join us from around the world. Welcome back to Creation Conversations, where we are back again and we have the full team with us, which is wonderful. And it's good to be back and it's good to see some people in the chat already. Happy New Year, everybody. Hope you had a good Christmas. And well, we've got a few updates for you this time because as we move forward in the year with Creation Conversations, we're in a new season. There are going to be a few changes, and we'll be reminding you of these changes as we go through. The first thing is that we're going to just try and shake things up a little bit by shifting our timing. We're actually going to shift the day as well as the time. We're going to focus on Australia for just a couple of months. So it's going to go out at sort of prime time Australian time, which I know is going to, most of you Americans probably won't be able to watch live because it is going to be 3 o'clock in the morning for you. But you, of course, can catch up on the videos afterwards. But that's not going to be a permanent decision, most likely. We're actually looking and we're in discussion as a team with regards to making a little bit of a hybrid system where we actually focus live videos on different parts of the world at different times in a sort of a 6-weekly cycle. So yes, you in the US will get 2 special USA broadcasts in that cycle, and we'll have a couple of broadcasts for Australia and for the UK mixed up with some interviews, with some headlines, with some more newsy items and a few pre-recorded things as well. So keep an eye out on our community chat as well as for some polls to get your opinion on some of this stuff as we look to sort of streamline Creation Conversations, but continue to produce and put out lots and lots of content. So the good news is that it's going to, hopefully, Lord willing, become a lot more accessible to all of you very soon. But we've got 2 weeks where we're going to stick to the, I suppose you could say, normal schedule. So that's this week and next week, and we've got some great topics to be dealing with. Today, we're going to be dealing with plant and animal domestication as we look at the definitions of domestication as well as the creation sort of connection and evolution and all these big questions about plants and animals and domestication and agriculture and all that kind of stuff. And we've got some great hands-on examples for you as well. But before we do all of that, it's been Christmas, it's been New Year, and Craig has still managed to find time to go out and get some fossils. So, Craig, you've got a little photo, which I'm going to just put up now. But do you want to just explain what you've been doing?
Yeah, well, my biggest challenge today was getting out of bed after being for 4 days up in the wilderness, and this is where we camped. It's called Lee's Paddocks, and one of our crew know the owners of Lee's Paddocks, but it's a little private property that's nestled in the middle of the World Heritage area of central Tasmania. And we set our tents up around the hut, and a number of the crew slept in the hut as well. And it was really great to be able to use that. Right along those hillsides, either side of the valley there's just literally billions of fossils, individual creatures buried. Mind you, we're in the centre of Tasmania, and our elevation at the hut there is about 600 metres above sea level. So we're finding them. We walked right up that valley and hit the overland track. If anyone's familiar with what is really world famous hike, and we joined the track there, and we didn't collect them as you're not allowed to in the wilderness area, but we found and identified fossils right up there on the overland track as well. So there'll be more of a report of that next week. I've got a bit of footage, so stay tuned, and hopefully we'll get something out for next Creation Conversations, so you can see what we're up to.
Great stuff. Thank you for that, Craig. And yes, one of the things about creation research is just how regularly we go out and do research and produce these reports. And it's not just about putting stuff out for you, it's about writing stuff up for our newsletters, and it's about getting more content for the museums as well, and getting the evidence out on display, as well as equipping us and you with the arguments that can be used against the lie of evolution. Well, we've got our main topic now. We've got our headlines to come a little bit later. I'll be presenting those. But we're going to start off with John, and Craig isn't going to be too far away because John and Craig are going to have a bit of a chat in a moment. But we're going to start with John predominantly giving us some hands-on examples and sort of kicking us off in this topic of domestication. So, John, over to you.
Thank you, Joe. Well, just before we came on this morning, had a small meeting and then a break, and Joe said, go and get a coffee. Well, I bought my own today. And you may know the famous jingle about 43 beans in every cup. Well, there's 43 beans. I know that because I grow coffee. In fact, my parents 70 years ago bought an old house that already had a coffee tree in the yard. And when I left there, I thought, well, caffeine, coffee, I'll pick a bean and I'll plant it. Now, I can vouch for the fact for the last 70 years, my coffee tree, and by the way, that literally is 43 beans because each of these little bean things has 2 or 3 seeds in it. So it's a bit hard to exactly say there's 43 beans, maybe 45, maybe 41. But 43 beans is what they boast, per cup. And I learned to make coffee. And the one thing I can say is for 70 years, coffee trees have produced their own kind. I'm not surprised because in Genesis chapter 1, it says, God said, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after its kind, whose seed is in itself. Yes, coffee seeds. You dry them, you roast them, you crush them, you dissolve them, and you go away and get ready for taking creation conversations in coffee. You realize we treat coffee as a domesticated plant because we grow it in big plantations, we harvest it, and we use it ourselves. Now, it's not like domestication with animals. We haven't trained the coffee to do anything. We may have selected the best varieties of coffee, but all that will come up during today's conversation. Perhaps I better take you through one of the plants that in Australia, it was found here. And it's really the only one that we've made use of. And certainly since I was a boy, this one has produced its own kind. Oh, what is it? These are, well, you call them today macadamias. Now, do you know what's in a name, that bit of poetry? A rose smells the same, no matter what you call it. Well, when I was a boy, this used to be called a bauple nut. And then a few years later, it was called a Queensland nut as the state became more aware of itself. And nowadays it's called macadamia. Well, that's an Australian name named after a politician in Melbourne who used to be an organic chemist. But largely we can thank the Americans in Hawaii for turning this little thing into a big industry and perhaps the most popular nut in the world. And it's got sugar, it's got fat, it's an incredibly rich food. And by the way, Bauple is not too far from here. And when Ludwig Leichhardt went exploring Queensland, one of the first German explorers, he picked up some bauple nuts. Well, the locals called them Kendall. That's the Aboriginal people who happily shared them with the first Europeans who were there, and they were delicious. Trouble is, as Diane will know and Craig will know, breaking into them is a nightmare. It's one reason they're so expensive, because they've got a really hard shell around them. And I remember for hours sitting on the concrete, banging these nuts, trying to not squash the nut, but yet get it out. If you wondered why they're so expensive, A, you have to grow them in large numbers. B, you then have to break into them. And one of my daughter's schoolgirl's father, he invented the machine that makes it much, much quicker. It's interesting. Bauple nuts, macadamia nuts, well, they're not cashews. They're actually a unique Australian one, and the only fruit that I know of that in Australia has been, well, we call it domesticated. You go from here just over the border into where the rainforest area is, and there's gazillions of macadamia nuts. It's been domesticated. It's harder to use domesticated for plants, but nevertheless, one of the things the bauple nut, the macadamia, the Queensland nut teaches you is that we've had climate change before in a big way. You see, my background is geology. I haven't found any fossil Queensland nuts, fossil macadamias, but right through central Queensland, you can find fossilized pollen in the sediments. And right throughout the whole of Australia, you can find evidence that the rainforest that the Queensland nut, the macadamia nut needs to actually grow, actually was all across Australia. And then before Europeans got here, and possibly just after Aborigines arrived, the climate radically changed until the Queensland nut, the bauple nut, the macadamia is only really found here in southeast Queensland, 1 or 2 species before you get to Bauple Mountain, and the main one when you get there. Oborpal, that's an Aboriginal word, and it means frilled lizard. The place is full of them. I've been there. And the Aborigines love the rocks that they hide in because they used to trade all of those rocks for making stone axes. Isn't it interesting what comes out of plants? But in all the time we've been here, the Queensland nut has produced its own kind. The macadamia is so valuable to produce because it does not evolve. Well, that's a first introduction. Let me just turn over in Genesis chapter 4 to someone who would have really struggled with trying to get his Queensland nuts to grow. It deals with Cain and Abel, and it's in chapter 4 because Cain has killed Abel, you might remember, the first murder on the planet. And God holds him up to public admission of this. Your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. And then God judges Cain. And here's what he says. From now on, the ground you till will not yield to you. You will be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth. Now, you've heard of people with their green thumbs. Well, he was exactly the opposite. He could kill anything if he tried. It wouldn't matter what quality fertilizer. And so Cain was a man who would have to find a different solution to living. He could not grow his own crops. Did he become the first person to domesticate animals? Or did he just become a trader? Or did he steal and rob from other people who were growing? We're never given the answer to that. But the whole context is negative. So when you look at the Bible, it's emphatic that God created the plants, he gave them to us. And Diane will be talking a lot about that. But you then get a person who can't actually use the plants or domesticate the plants. Did he start domesticating the animals? Diane will talk a bit more about that. But I've got one person in the studio today, Craig, and Craig is a bit of a forestry expert, and he's got a good illustration of what happens if you domesticate a plant to the point where you actually multiply it, and there's a result that you may not expect. Craig, do you want to come on screen and share a little bit about Pinus radiata and your experience in forestry with it?
Yeah, so Pinus radiata is now one of the world's most planted trees, and it's one that I've had a little bit to do with in Australia. In the 1940s, 1950s, Australia and perhaps other parts of the world too were looking for species to mass plant for timber purposes. And so in Australia, a number of trials were set up in different parts of the country, South Australia, right through New South Wales and even up into Queensland. And they were trying different pine trees from around the world. And Pinus radiata, as it's commonly known, is also known as Monterey Bay pine. And it was one that did particularly well in Australia, but it's also widely planted in other countries like South Africa and New Zealand. And it grew well in its first sort of 10 years, and that was a good indicator, good enough for the foresters at the time to select it as being the major one to target. And so from the 1950s, 60s, these trial plots were set up, and in the 1970s, 80s, the mass plantings really started. And when I started my forestry career full time, well, actually, when I was still at uni, I did some work with planting and fertilising these trees in the highlands of New South Wales. And I was still buying up properties, and it's been mass planted. But before too long, a number of diseases started impacting it. There's the Cyrex wood wasp, and there's another leaf rot that occurs with it. And so people were concerned that the genetic diversity of the tree was being diminished too much. They became very concerned that we need to make sure we preserve the native plants of the Monterey Bay pine, which only occurs on the Monterey Islands area and maybe a little bit on the coast as well, which is in California, in the USA. The native trees of the Monterey pine are actually fairly rare. So it's a little bit like wheat is the same. The ancient sort of native wheats really important for their genetic diversity, because over many centuries people have domesticated that as well, and perhaps John will talk about that a bit more, but it's certainly been the case, because when you're trying to grow a timber species, you want straight grains. You don't want thick branching so that the knots in the wood aren't too big. You don't want sort of crooked trees and multiple stemmed trees. So you keep selecting those trees which are growing nice and straight. They don't have too heavy a branching and all these spiral grain and impacts on the grain, because everyone wants nice, strong, straight-grained timber. So this continual selection that was occurring was causing a real problem in the genetics ultimately. Although it's still widely planted, it's still being used, and there's just been various inputs been out of it for a little while now, but it's still widely planted and being used for timber across the world.
So really what you're saying, Craig, is if we just take one variety and we multiply it, we're really multiplying the defects in it as well? Is that what you're saying?
Well, we're certainly reducing the genetic diversity on them to focus on the genes of those features we're targeting, that's for sure.
All right. Well, I'll give you one last example of this before we bring Diane onto the picture. Here in Queensland, the southerners like Craig and Diane may know people who insult the people who live in Queensland. They call us banana benders. Now, you may not know where that comes from, but in reality, when banana trees bear their crop, all the fruits point straight down. The birds can easily access the flowers at the end of them to fertilize them. But then you notice that the fruits themselves turn upwards. They bend towards the sun. So please stop calling us Queensland banana benders, even though we have a native fruit banana in Queensland. It's very seedy, so you don't commercialize it. But we commercialize these ones because they don't have seeds. But the same problem has occurred. As the banana plant has spread all over the world and we've domesticated it, I'm still old enough to remember when you were told you were no longer to plant ladyfinger, this really sweet one, because of a certain disease that had gone through Panama and all of that. And you could only plant Cavendish. So Mr. Cavendish was claimed as the savior of the banana industry. And now, because we've been planting Cavendish trees for so long, and they're huge trees, although tree's not the right word, they are stopped, they only bear one crop and then they'll die, and you plant them by suckers. So like the Pinus radiata, you don't have any genetic diversity. Now you can find the evidence that even the big Cavendish ones are beginning to suffer increased number of the mutations that are being bred in by the use of this. So we've domesticated the banana beyond a shadow of a doubt. We've bred for those that don't have seeds, which means we've made it genetically really, we're stuck with just physical reproduction, not the way that birds and bees do things, and we're paying a price for domesticating the banana. So buy yours quickly before they die out, or we'll have to find a new way to grow bananas. Now, Diane and I were talking about this program yesterday and the day before, and I'd done some interesting looking up of domestication. Domestication. There was one article I shared with Diane. I said, I even found an article that asked, have women been domesticated? We talked about feminists and how that might apply to them, because the logic is man was an animal. And so somebody thought of the idea of living together and getting everyone to cooperate or whatever. The Bible has the opposite. Man was made in a garden. The garden was not chosen by man. The plants were chosen by God and put there by God. So, Diane, you're going to give us an interesting look at animal domestication for this section here before we have it throw it up for our first Q&A. So take it away, Diane.
Yes, the standard story for domestication is that humans evolved from apes and became hunter-gatherers, and then eventually they made use of the animals that were around them and the plants that are around them, and then they settled down and became farmers, settled farmers, and then as we advanced further on, various aspects of civilization and urban development came into being. But that is the very opposite of the standard of the real story that is clearly set out in the Bible. And domestication has become, or is actually, rather a mystery to the people who believe that evolutionary story, because they wonder, well, how did it happen? Because we have tried to domesticate some animals in modern times, and it hasn't really worked. And so we've got a couple of examples. If we can just go to my slides. Hang on. Okay, have the slides come up?
Yeah, we're good. Go for it.
Okay, good. Right, if I can just get the slides to advance. All right, so domestic animals and plants, well, basically we're talking about animals that are kept by humans for food, for fibers, for transport or companionship, and plants that are deliberately cultivated by humans, right, again, for food, fibers or structure, as in plantation wood, or aesthetics. Now, you may think that the last two of those things in each of those little summaries, companionship and aesthetics, are frivolous, but they're not. They are part of being human, and we do see that in the Bible. We have to remember that human beings are body, soul, and spirit. So your soul matters as much as meeting the needs of your body for things like food and clothing and shelter and things like that. So those are the sort of plants and animals that we're talking about, that we're all familiar with. And quite a few years ago, about 10 years ago, actually, I came across this article in Science Daily, which is one of the science report sources that we use for our newsletters. And they asked this question: why have so few of the available plants and animals become domesticated historically? So what happened in the past that a few animals and plants became domesticated, when there are sort of millions of plants and animals, but only a few are genuinely domesticated in terms of using those things that we've just talked about. And the other question was, why haven't more species of either plants or animal been domesticated in modern times? Because people have tried to domesticate things which are not traditional farm animals or cultivated plants, and they haven't really succeeded all of that well. Now, there are differences between domestic and wild animals, but the assumption that this is some sort of evolutionary process doesn't always work out. And I've got a couple of examples just from our fact file. And there are various theories as to how this could have happened. And this one we came across a while ago. Hang on, the slides aren't moving again. Let me see if I can get them to do so. Where are we going here?
Sam or Joe, can you help with that?
There we go. Yeah, they're good. We're good again.
Yes, good. All right. This was a story that described domestication, well, basically as a dog's breakfast. All right. The standard story about domestic dogs is that they are descended from wolves. Now, we don't dispute that there is a link between domestic dogs and wolves, but the story might be the other way around in terms of what the evolutionists believe and what's set out in the biblical history. And the standard story is that somehow wolves became associated with humans as they were beginning to settle down and take up farming, which meant they were sort of growing their own food, and the wolves would have scavenged from the waste dumps where the refuse was left over. And that would have contained plant-based foods like potatoes and grains, which are the sort of things that even the cavemen ate. And there's good evidence that so-called cavemen didn't live on a carnivore diet. They ate a mixed diet of grains and various other plant foods. And so this theory was that, well, maybe the wolves that could digest starchy sort of foods best stayed with humans because it was easy source of food, and those gave rise to dogs. And so someone decided to do a genetic study and to see whether that would fit. And sure enough, they did this gene study of wolves and dogs, and they had 12 wolves and 60 dogs from different breeds of dogs. And they found some interesting variations in 3 genes that actually enhance starch digestion. And they found dogs have more copies of a gene called AMY. That you don't need to worry about the names. Dogs also had a more efficient version of a couple of other genes that are important in starch digestion. And this is an important side thing. We need to remember genes do not work in isolation. So any evolutionary theories about things happening one by one mutation at a time doesn't work. Even within our cells, the individual genes don't work on their own. And anyway, they came up with this conclusion. In conclusion, we presented evidence that dog domestication was accompanied by a selection of 3 genes with key roles in starch digestion, and they named them there. So what they're saying is that what happened in domestication is that dogs, the animals that became domestic dogs, somehow changed these genes. And they went on to say our results show that adaptations that allowed early ancestors of modern dogs to thrive on a diet rich in starch relative to the carnivorous diet of wolves constituted a crucial step in early dog domestication. So notice the evolutionary language: selection, adaptation. Now, John, I know that you're a keen dog lover. What sort of things does your dog eat?
My dog eats chicken food. It eats grape. It digs up my potatoes and eats them. So this is my experience for ages. I've got to lock the gate on the garden or the dog will eat the crop.
Yes. All right. So obviously your dog has these genes and they're working well. And so um, so we need to think about, well, this is real evidence. There is this difference. But how did it come about? Or what was the change that happened that makes wolves different from dogs? Is it that they started out as wolves and then the dogs somehow changed their genes to become more efficient? Or perhaps something happened the other way around? Perhaps it was that the dogs already had these efficient genes and some dogs lost them, and therefore they had to depend on more of a carnivore diet. So let's go back to those 2 questions. Why have so few of the available plants and animals become domesticated historically? In other words, what happened in the past? And why haven't more species of either plants or animals been domesticated in modern times? Well, perhaps the story is backwards. And in fact, the evidence from biblical history is that that story is backwards. And what's happened is actually a loss of genes or a decrease in efficiency. And the example of the Pinus radiata is a good one there. There are differences between domestic and wild animals, but some of them may have already been built in. And so our answer to those 2 questions is that we didn't actually domesticate animals. Some animals and plants seem to be designed to live close to humans. It just seems to be an inherent feature of them. And just as a sort of quirky aside, someone did an interesting study about chimps versus dogs. Because chimps are supposed to be our closest evolutionary cousins, our closest evolutionary relatives. Do they show any signs of having affinity with human beings? Right, whereas dogs definitely have an affinity with human beings. That's well observed, but we're a little bit further away from them in the evolutionary tree. And so someone actually did do an interesting study of chimps versus dogs. And this is the title of their paper. Dogs, that is Canis familiaris, but not chimpanzees, Pan troglodytes. Now, don't you just love scientific names, right? Canis familiaris. I think that's very descriptive. I'm not quite sure why they called the chimpanzee Pan troglodytes. Does anyone know what a troglodyte is, if you just use that as an ordinary English word?
Lives in a
cave
cave.
dweller, yeah.
That's right. That's someone who lives in a cave. Well, chimpanzees don't actually live in caves, so I'm not quite sure why they ended up with this name. It has come to mean someone who sort of lives hidden away on their own. But even chimpanzees are actually quite, they're very social, actually. They live in groups, but there might be some interesting history in there. But this experiment involved a behavioural study of the response to human gestures to find food, where they set up an experiment where a human being would indicate where the animal could find food, not by speaking, but by gesturing, mainly by pointing and various other gestures. And the interesting thing is that dogs responded correctly. Now, these were dogs that were not trained to respond to human. They were actually quite young ones that hadn't been trained to respond to human physical gestures. But they responded correctly, whereas chimpanzees failed quite miserably. So interesting thing there. And I think it's a good indication that some animals were designed to live with human beings for good reasons. And in fact, we see that if we go back to Genesis and just look at the creation of the land animals, animals are already divided into three categories in Genesis 1. Where it says, God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kind. And depending on which version you read, but some animals are already described as livestock before there were any people around, right? Remember, the land animals were created and then human beings were created all on the same day. So not very far ahead, but they're already classified as livestock. And in some older translations, that word there that's translated as livestock is translated as cattle, because English, being a living language, has changed its meaning since the 1600s, and cattle used to have a wider meaning than just cows. So livestock, creeping things or animals that crawl on the ground, and the beasts of the earth. And again, according to their kind, God says that 10 times. And no matter what we do, when we try and domesticate animals and plants or cultivate them, they still multiply after their kind. And then that's reiterated as God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, including livestock. And if we go a couple of days back, we have the creation of plants, and it says, let the earth sprout forth vegetation, plants yielding seed, fruit trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to their kind. So there are already plants that we would recognize as fruit trees, as seed-bearing plants, because just about all the plants that we eat are seed-bearing plants. Seaweed would probably be about the only one that I can think of that we eat regularly that isn't a seed-bearing plant. And again, according to their kinds. And then we are, in the next chapter, we are told about cultivated plants, and it was God who created the first garden. God planted a garden in Eden in the east, and he put the man in there. So straight away, we have cultivated plants. We were meant to live in a place surrounded by cultivated plant, and notice they were pleasing to the sight and good for food. Everything God made was beautiful and functional. We usually manage to do one or the other. but it did matter that they were pleasing to the sight and good for food. So they were providing for us in body and soul. And the tree of life was in the midst of the garden. Now, the world has changed since then, but this is how God set up the world. And so what we would call domestic plants and animals were there, built into the creation. Now, since then, the history of human beings is very different from the evolutionary story. Here we started off as gardeners, the next generation farmers, and then we've degenerated. And so the loss of being able to cultivate animals and plants is actually a loss in human beings, because the world has changed due to human sin and God's judgment. And maybe we can talk about that as we go on. If we can come back to us, and we may have generated a few questions by now from what we've said.
Well, we've got Glenn's report for the Creation News, I believe. Isn't that the case, Glenn?
Not quite. I've got the creation news, which we'll get onto in a little bit. Glenn has got a report as well, which we've kind of swapped things around a little bit, but that's not a problem. I suggest that we do now is indeed do some thank yous and some questions, and then what we'll do is I'll do the headlines, and then we've got a report from Glenn as well about plant and animal domestication. But anybody got any comments or things to add on to what we've discussed so far before we go to questions?
Well, I just said one thing that builds on what Diane said. The first mention of farming is in Genesis chapter 4, where Cain was a tiller of the ground. Remember the guy who killed his brother Abel? And he had that talent removed from him because the ground wouldn't yield to him as a punishment for his sin. But his brother Abel kept sheep. So in one generation, you have the evidence that sheep are now in flocks, regardless of what they use them for, whether they're coverings or whatever. They certainly didn't eat them as meat, because that didn't happen until after Noah's flood. But you have flocks of sheep. You have a means of controlling them, so you have authority that's being exercised, and the sheep are reacting. Now, I've had sheep on my property, and I'll be honest, at the moment, I regard them as some of the dumbest creatures I've ever met. I don't mean that as an insult, but it's certainly they dumbed down an awful long way since Cain and Abel's day. But that's just built on what you've said there, Diane. It's right from the beginning we had that domestication of both the plants and the animals.
Yes, I once read a sort of biography written by a farmer about his experiences, and he described sheep as being a curious mixture of fecklessness and hardiness. They are hardy in that they can live in sort of fairly wild and tough places like the Yorkshire Moors and things like that, but they are feckless as well.
Yeah, I heard one farmer say a sheep wakes up every morning wondering, how can I kill myself today?
Well, in defense of John, I took animal science course at LSU, and the animal science professor said that sheep was the dumbest animal that God put on the earth.
Yeah. All right.
Good stuff. Let's go to some thank yous and questions, Sam.
Alrighty. So we've got a super chat coming in from Douglas Boffey for 10 British Buckaroos. Hi everyone. Hope you all had a happy new year. Hope 2025 will be a blessed year for us all. May the sovereign God be foremost in all our lives. God bless. Amen to that. Douglas. We've also got 2 CHF from Fleurella. Lemon character running, then kneeling on the floor, his arms wide open, and then a slice of lemon appearing behind him.
Sounds very complicated.
I think I'm probably going to skip that one. I think just in the interest of time. Yeah. We've got Doki Doki coming in with 3 US Buckaroos. Hippo character in tactical gear does tactical flanking maneuver hand gestures. Go go go! I don't know. I don't know. I'm trying. We've also got another super sticker from Doki Doki coming in with 4 US Buckaroos. A character handing over a cup of coffee saying, "For you." Oh, well, there you go. For you.
Yes,
Thank you
we
so
could
much.
do with a cup of coffee.
Thank you so much, Doki. And see if we've got any other ones. We've got another one from Doki Doki coming with 149 US buckaroos. A yellow dog. Just a yellow dog. I don't have a dog, so I can't do that one, unfortunately.
Yellow, come back yellow. Yes, doggone dog in the west. It's a
We've also
famous
got Iron Man.
movie. You had to do Oh Yellow.
Oh, yellow, yeah.
We've also got Iron Man coming in with 4 US buckaroos. A pair character exaggeratingly stretching his arm forward to offer a cup of coffee. Oh, we've had 2 cups of coffee. You see?
I've got some
So
beans
generous.
here. You can stew them up afterwards, mate.
Oh, there you go. Right, let's do a question first of all. Are dogs a product of evolution? From Doki.
This is another
That's
one of those
irony.
one-word answers, isn't it?
It is, yes. But we do have plenty of stuff like that on the Ask site of the fact file, Diane, correct?
Yes, we have quite a few items about dogs. We also did a whole program on dogs a while ago. So there's, if you go back into the archive of creation conversations, we did creation in the doghouse.
They've certainly changed. If you wanted to find evolution has changed, but they've only reproduced after their kind.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I get amazed when I fly and I see rich ladies carrying a miniature mutant in their purse. I think it's supposed to be a dog, but what we did to it, I'm not sure. The poor thing.
We've got another question here from Douglas Buffett. Well, you've got a question: if dinos died out or evolved into birds millions of years ago, where did Fred Flintstone get his creatures?
You do realise, Douglas, that when you ask these questions, these will end up as standalone answers on YouTube. So yeah, they will be immortalised. But actually, it's interesting. You just forgetting the Fred Flintstone bit. We were just chatting in our meeting just before we went live about dinosaurs evolving into birds, particularly dinosaurs and feathers and stuff. And Craig, you've been doing a bit of research and kind of charting and graphing out the sort of the evolutionary claims to how dinosaurs are related to each other and stuff. And one of the things that we were discussing, what were you saying about Sinosauropteryx, Craig, about being one of the furthest away from modern birds?
Yeah, it's in terms of the coelurosaurs, which is the broader group that includes the Tyrannosaurus Rex and not Allosaurus, Sinosauropteryx, and right down through to the Velociraptor and the modern birds. The Sinosauropteryx, which has only had one fossil, as far as I'm aware, that's been found with a few fibers on it. It's the furthest away. It's even further away than Tyrannosaurus Rex from modern birds.
Yeah, and we point out in several of our programs, I have a whole program on feathered dinosaurs, is that Sinosauropteryx, which is supposedly one of the oldest and the first sort of, proto feathers that come up the furthest away from modern birds, it's dated at around 124 to 122 million years. Now, of course, I don't believe in those dates, but it does show a little bit of a problem when you consider the fact that Archaeopteryx, which has been determined to be a fully functioning bird, a true bird, yes, it's claimed as being the earliest bird, but it's still a bird, and that was determined by the Natural History Museum in London, so a secular organisation. They did a number of studies on the morphology as well as an internal scan of its brain, and Diane can probably comment on just how unique a bird's brain is, so you know whether you're looking at a bird brain, and it's highly sophisticated despite the common use of the insult, right? But they determined that the Archaeopteryx was indeed a fully functioning bird. Now that becomes a problem because remember, Sinosauropteryx, one of the most primitive, supposedly furthest away from modern birds, dated at 122 to 124 million years old. Archaeopteryx is dated at 155 million years old. So we're talking, 25 million years before you're supposed to have even, started evolving. You have a fully functioning bird in the fossil record. And National Geographic published a little while back this lovely graphic of the Velociraptor evolving all the way up into a modern bird. And we basically take that and we say, okay, well, let's not even discuss the science of this. Let's just look at the dates. And one thing you'll find is that the oldest thing on that sequence is the Archaeopteryx, which is the true bird. And one of the youngest things is the Velociraptor, which is supposedly fully dinosaur. And it's just a complete muddled mess. When you get out there and look at the fossil record, you don't see this nice, steady evolutionary sequence. What you do see, though, are creatures reproducing after their own kind. And as far back as we go in the fossil record, birds have always been birds.
I'm going to take it.
Another side to that question, though. To me, the question was about Fred Flintstone finding his creatures, and the story is a picture of the fact that humans lived at the same time as dinosaurs, and that's an historical fact that's documented by some of the most famous historians, Pliny the Elder, Marco Polo, fairly recently, that they live side by side. And then you look at the observations, we have in cultures all over here in America of Native Americans drawing on the rocks pictures of dinosaurs, yet they didn't have any bones to know what they looked like. It's because they were still in existence. So the story of Fred Flintstone is a pretty good picture of, yes, they lived at the same time as dinosaurs.
I'll take that theme a little further, Glenn, because as the person who used to do all the cartoons in the original Creation Ex Nihilo magazine, I've loved Fred Flintstone since he first appeared on the screen. But what I remember very vividly is looking at the science groups who pressured schools all around the world to get the kids to not watch Fred Flintstone because it was politically incorrect. Right? They really did put pressure on academics, on schools, on educators. Don't talk about Fred Flintstone. It's so politically incorrect because man didn't evolve till millions of years after the dinosaurs. And yet in reality, Fred Flintstone himself is a creation of the artist, right? We do know what creation is all about, where something like your pencil can actually produce an artwork, whether it's my cartoons in Ex Nihilo or whether it's the artist who did Fred Flintstone. The evidence points to creativity, which points to us made in God's image as creator. So next question, Sam.
Yeah, just goes to show that you can turn even a Fred Flintstone question into a serious discussion. But there we go.
Right. We've got Doki Doki asking, is a pet crocodile a good idea?
Sam, I'm going to be talking about that during my talk.
Well, there you go. So sneak preview there. We've got this is an interesting question here.
Is it a proper question? We've got a proper question.
It is a proper question. It's Douglas.
Mm.
Douglas asks, question, if the fall hadn't happened, would the animals be domestic?
I think Diane and John have sort of answered that one, haven't they? A little bit with the sheep. And
Yeah, we would have been living at peace with the animals, just as the Bible talks about in the new heaven and the new earth. And the child is going to put their hand into the vipers, and we're going to be the wild animals of today are going to be tamed, domesticated. I'm looking forward to having a pet dinosaur.
Pet crocodiles would have been out still, but never mind. You can talk about that later.
You still have to bear in mind that even in the very good world, right, or in fact, at the very good world, you still had a natural order, which was God over man and man over animals. And so man was given dominion over animals, even in the very good world. Now, that dominion in the fallen world can be corrupted. The dominion in the fallen world will certainly take on a different look because we live in a fallen world. We're evil. The animals have gone downhill, and you wouldn't go and necessarily ride on a crocodile. But in a very good world, part of that dominion, and John has pointed this out several times, is that no crocodile would dare bite God's special creation that has authority over it. Now, that is broken down because not only has man's relationship with God broken down, even though we still have dominion over the animals, it's not the same relationship that it would have been in the beginning. And so when you think about domestication, part of this is going to be the result of a fallen world. We now live in a world where you can't go out and grab the nearest plant and eat it, and it be good for you. You could be spending an hour chewing on it, or it might kill you, or it might be delicious. It's a bit of a gamble, right? But we live in a world where, as a result of that, we now need flocks of sheep for meat, for clothing. We need mass production of these things, and so we have a breakdown of that relationship, which wouldn't have been needed in the beginning, even in the very good world.
Just excuse me a moment. I'm being communicated with by my domesticated dog. He's jumping up on the window saying, I want to come in. So I'll bring my domesticated dog.
You're bringing an example in. Very good. Sam, do we have any final thank yous before we move on to the next section of Creation Conversations?
Yeah, we've got this one coming from Who Little or Me. Super sticker for 10 Aussie Buckaroos. Pair character rolling on the floor laughing.
Thank you very much.
I won't roll on the floor, but I'll do a laugh. There you go.
Oh,
So
someone
we just-
thinks our program is funny.
And we just saw a perfect picture of domestication because John's dog has him trained.
Yeah.
I'm very domesticated. Come on,
You're
dog.
domesticated, are you? Yeah, very good. Very good.
Hey,
All
There
right,
he is.
well,
a
We've
lovely
come
wolf
to-
cross.
what was that? Sorry, say again. Oh, yeah, got your dog.
A
Yeah,
lovely
yeah.
wolf cross German Shepherd. Down.
Well, we've come to the part of the program where we're about to do our creation headlines for this week, which I will be going through them with you. So Sam can start to get ready to sort everything out. We're going to do the headlines, and then once we finish that, we're going to go over to Glenn. He's got a section to share with us about domestication and pet crocodiles, apparently. So we're looking forward to that. And then we'll finish up with some questions and answers towards the end. So Sam, if everything is ready on your end, we are good to go. Hello and welcome to Creation Headlines. I'm Joseph Hubbard, and today we're bringing you news from around the world relevant to creation and the Bible. We start with a giant discovery, quite literally. Over 200 dinosaur footprints have been discovered in a UK quarry by a worker while working a digger. This prompted a large-scale excavation last year, which recently featured on the BBC programme Digging for Britain. The main footprints found belong to Megalosaurus, a T-Rex-like theropod dinosaur, and sauropods, the long-necked dinosaurs. And the footprints make up the largest trackway discovered in the UK. Of course, what was not pointed out, either by the study or by the Digging for Britain programme, was the significance of the rock type that they were actually buried in, limestone. Now, fossiliferous limestone is typically a marine deposit laid down by water, and this deposit is no exception. And having myself and John both collected from this Jurassic rock sequence across the UK, I can certainly confirm that footprints like these are buried next to seashells, deep-sea creatures, and smashed and broken trees. All of this points to a catastrophic burial, with these creatures desperately attempting to escape the rising waters. Add this to the fact that the Jurassic sediments go around the world, and you're certainly looking at a worldwide flood. Next, the University of Bristol has announced the results of a study on Smilodon, or saber-toothed tiger skulls, and their teeth. They've used sophisticated scans and modelling techniques, and they claim that the unique incisor teeth were functionally optimal and, quote-unquote, a masterpiece of evolution. However, it is worth pointing out that this evolutionary masterpiece is, of course, now extinct. And this really highlights the harsh reality of evolution if it was true. Survival of the fittest simply means extinction of the unfit, and even evolution cannot supposedly produce a creature that is not vulnerable to this. Now, from a biblical perspective, we may not know what the original cat kind looked like, but we do know from the scriptures that in the beginning, everything was very good. Teeth were designed to eat plants, and the reason why cats now eat meat is the same reason why the Smilodon went extinct. It's down to man's sin leading to a cursed world, which led to a change of environments and a necessity for survival techniques. The real history of the world is good to bad to worse. Finally, scientists from the universities of Edinburgh and Zurich have solved a long-time mystery of pterosaur flight, which was, of course, how did these creatures actually fly? Well, with the help of new laser technology, they've been able to model flight simulations and have found that a feature of lattice-like veins running down their tail are key. The researchers have said that the diamond-shaped structures made from interwoven membranes prevented the animal's tail from fluttering like flags in the wind and instead helped to guide and stabilize them in flight. They explained that the veins most likely behaved like a sail on a ship, becoming tense as the wind blew through their cross-linked membranes and therefore enabling the reptiles to use them to steer through the sky. The scientists said, quote unquote, this design is extremely sophisticated and also could revolutionize modern flight techniques and designs. Well, all this goes to prove is that it takes an incredible amount of science and research to work out how these creatures flew, and the end result can only be described as a masterful design. Reality is there is simply no way that flight could ever evolve, and we can now use this brilliant design of God's and apply it to our inventions. Remember, though, God thought of it first. Well, that brings us to the end of this week's Creation Headlines. There we go. All right, Glenn, it's over to you. We're going to carry on with our plant-animal domestication conversations. We've got about half an hour or so left, so Glenn's going to give us a bit of a program, and then we'll turn back to questions and go from there. So hopefully your slides are up and ready, Glenn, and it's over to you.
I think you go to me, or you see my slides now?
We're all good.
Show us your pet crocodile.
Good. Yeah. Well, this started off with John asking me if I knew anybody that, being, from Louisiana originally, where there's a lot of alligators, if I knew anybody who had a pet alligator. And so I started looking up some information and just got this, article on the difference between domestic animals and wild animals. And it basically, they put together a chart of the differences, but it's really pretty much what Diane was saying about the differences. Well, this is my brother-in-law in his backyard. He does have a license for hunting alligators. And so, he's got alligators that are right there in his yard. And he's pulled them off of his porch before. But can you have a tame alligator? Well, two of my best friends growing up, Mike and Duke Landry, they had a pet alligator. Now, it was only about a foot long, and it was scary. I'm telling you, I was scared of that thing because we would try to get it out of its little aquarium we had set up for it, and it would try to take your finger off. And we could never get it to be tame. But one day I was over at their house, and it was storming, it was raining, and their backyard was flooding. So we thought, well, let's let it out and let it swim for a little while in the backyard. And, well, we forgot about it and never found it again. I can just tell you, alligators don't make good pets. But if anybody could make a pet out of an alligator, it would be this man here, Randy. First time I met my brother-in-law, he was probably about, 10 years old. He was riding his sister through our neighborhood. We grew up in the same neighborhood. He was riding her pink little bike, my wife's bike. And what did he have in the basket on the front? But a skunk. Not a tame skunk. It was a skunk that he trapped, and over about a month, he tamed it. He never removed the skunk glands, the smell glands. He just turned it into a pet. And he took that skunk all over the neighborhood. And that was the first time I ever met the man. So yeah, he could take a skunk and just make it into a pet, just like a cat, went everywhere he went. Well, we all love dogs. We talked about John, but one of the scariest animals out there is a dog that turns feral. And I can tell you, for someone that goes around hunting, a feral dog is a dangerous, dangerous animal. But what about cats? Cats are lovely. I love cats. That's my favorite. I have my cats here with me right now. But there was a time when my cats were scared to go out on the front porch. And they wouldn't even go outside. They were so scared. And so I put a little trap outside and caught a cat that looked just like this one. But that thing was a beast. That thing was so wild. I couldn't even get it out of the cage. All I could do was just release it because, I took it away from my house before I released it because it was so wild. Later, I caught another wildcat on our back porch, and my wife and I took about 2 months, and we finally domesticated it and got it to where we could pet it. But that thing was the most muscular cat. It was so muscle bound, and it finally turned into a sweet, loving cat. Turkeys. We have domesticated turkeys. But here's pictures from my game cameras because some of those domesticated turkeys, which are produced in our area, they get out and they live with the wild turkeys. Hogs. We have hog productions around here. Well, I've also got wild hogs on my property. And in fact, my son-in-law and I don't want to offend people, but we will hunt these. And we shot in 2011 what would have been, if we would have had sense enough to check it in, the state record of Mississippi, because this was a 450-pound hog. I think it was a domesticated one that had turned wild because of its ear being clipped. So what I say all this to say, what is the real difference between a domesticated and wild? It can be a fine line because a domesticated animal can go wild and then totally change, not just in their behavior, but physically change. Hogs are a good example of that. Now, I don't know about you guys, but many people, this is a new year. Many people take on this year I'm going to change my diet. I'm going to change my exercise. We make a commitment at the new year to change things. Well, hogs, when they are out wild, they change their diet, they change their exercise. And what that does is it changes their hormone levels, and that changes them physically, including to, growing much larger tusks, much longer hair. So they don't just change in their behavior, they actually change physically. And that's in the whole area of science, where you talk about, is it genotype or is it phenotype? Well, that's epigenetics. That is, epi comes from the Greek word to means outside of the genetics. There can be a change in the cell function without changing the DNA, just based upon the changes in the hormone. A reflection of the change of diet, change of activity. These hogs are living in the wild. Now all of a sudden they're having to defend themselves, fight off. They start producing more testosterone, and that changes their physical structure. So I just wanted to put that out there. I'm going to stop sharing. You can go back to me, Joe. Is that, let me find myself here. It is that there's a fine line between this domestication and wild, and animals can go back and forth, because domesticated is kind of a term that we came up with. I think we talked about this earlier. In the beginning, before there was sin, we were to have dominion over all the animals. They were all domesticated in that sense and living in peace. But we live in a fallen world. And even our nice, sweet dog that is so nice can revert back to being wild and dangerous. So can cats. Let me tell you, there's nothing scarier than that cat I trapped. So with that, Joe, I'll end, and I probably stirred up a lot of questions from that.
Glenn, I'll add one more thing to you, because you Americans are so fond of Skippy the kangaroo. We do not have kangaroo farms, and they breed by the millions without our help, and they are never domesticated when they are anywhere near mature.
Like the alligators, I don't think you'll ever domesticate them. But it would have been nice living in peace with them.
Mm-hmm.
All right, great stuff. Thank you for that. Sam, do we have any more thank yous to add on, and then maybe a few more questions before we begin to close things down and wrap things up in the next little while?
Sure, yeah. We've got Doki Doki coming in with 149 US buckaroos, a purple cat. Lovely jubbly. Love me a nice purple cat. We've also got
domesticated one.
another yellow dog coming in from Who Little of Me there. That's it in terms of thank yous. Do you want to do a question or do you want to move on?
Ryan, can I ask you a question that's relevant before Joe takes the questions there? You mentioned chimpanzees, but you didn't get on to adult chimpanzees. What's the difference in Hollywood between those two, please?
Well, if you watch the movies where they show chimpanzees living with human beings and doing all sorts of really clever things, those are all juveniles. They are amenable to being trained, even though they don't naturally relate to human gestures, but they can be trained, usually with food rewards, where it's interesting that dogs can be trained with the reward being human praise and pats and words of praise and things like that, not just food rewards. But chimpanzees can be trained to do things. But once they become beyond about 8 years old, they become quite intractable. And an adult chimpanzee is actually a large and dangerous wild animal. So the ones that you see in the Hollywood movies are juveniles that can be trained and are amenable to living with human beings, but they rapidly grow out of that. But most of their lifespan, and they can live into their 40s, so they've got a long lifespan after the age of about 8. And then you have the question, well, what do you do with them? Because they have been brought up in captivity, and that gets into animal rights issues, which is another issue that maybe we could talk about at some other time.
In fact, Diane, aren't some of the famous sort of so-called chimpanzee trainers or people who made much of their human likeness, weren't they killed by chimpanzees?
Yes, chimpanzee is an adult chimpanzee is quite dangerous, and the same with people who have tried to bring up wild animals like lions, and those sort of what we would call wild animals, meaning dangerous animals that will kill people. Even they have been killed by the very animals that they have brought up once they become adults. So there are some animals which in adult form are quite intractable to being domesticated. And I think the same goes for the alligators that live in that live in Louisiana. And any crocodile farmer will tell you, yes, you can control them to a certain extent, but they never become pets.
Yeah.
No, it's like the
And I mean, hardly a week goes by here. If you read a paper called the Northern Territory Times, which up in Darwin, hardly a week goes by when there isn't a story about a crocodile attack. And some of these get onto the worldwide news. And I can remember staying with some of my friends in England, and there had been a story on the BBC about a crocodile attack where a British person was actually killed by a crocodile. At the same time, I was introduced to one of their neighbours, this is our friend from Australia. And this person said, oh, but your country is lethal, because they'd read about the crocodile attack.
Yeah. And alligators are very passive, and they're pretty harmless. I'm still scared to death of them, but my Cajun buddies, they're not scared of them at all, and just walk right up to them, grab them. Randy, he just grabs them off of his porch. But the dangerous ones are ones that have been fed by people and they get over their fear of people. Then they become dangerous. It's why feral dogs are so dangerous. They don't have a fear of people. You see a coyote in the woods, he's heading the other direction, but a feral dog has no fear of people. That's when they're dangerous.
Now that's interesting, Glenn, because the saltwater croc doesn't seem to be quite like that. I watched a show at the Australia Zoo, I think they call it. That's Steve Irwin, the Crocodile Hunters Zoo, and his son was taking the show, and They do this several times a day, daily, where they have the big crowd there and they're showing the crocs and they bring them in. And when he was on land, he was cautious, but not in as much danger. But then he'd go and step in the water, and he said, and he'd get out of it very quickly, because as soon as he's in the water, the croc feels he's in his territory, and he's in severe danger then. So yeah, it doesn't seem you can domesticate the saltwater croc at all.
At all. Yeah.
All right, questions.
Anything from you, Sam, for questions? Anything that's come through?
No, not that. I've got this one here. Melissa Cook asks, before the flood, man only ate vegetation, and afterwards humankind could eat meat. What evidence is there that humankind was meant to eat meat?
Humankind was meant to eat meat. Diane, it's easier to digest meat than it is to digest vegetables, correct?
Yes, we have a relatively short digestive system, so it is actually easier to break down animal proteins. But that doesn't mean we were meant to eat meat. It just means that we can.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
And I think meant is a bit of a misnomer. If you mean meant, then originally we were not meant to eat meat. Originally we were meant to eat plants. But you have to remember that it wasn't just us who has gone downhill, if you like, because of the curse. Remember, the whole world has gone from good to bad to worse, but it's also the plants. So it means not only are we no longer as efficient or good in our bodies at digesting plants, the plants are no longer as good for us as they used to be. Now, plants are still very healthy. We can still eat plants. Plants are still very good for you. But we now live in a world where not only have we gone downhill, not only have the plants gone downhill, but the climate has gone downhill too. Now, you remember the commandment for eating meat, or the allowance, if you like, for eating meat, goes hand in hand with the commandment to spread out into all the world. Now, the reality is, with the best will in the world, there's very few places on earth that you can live as a 100% vegetarian unless you have a local supermarket, right? You simply can't do it out on the frozen tundra. You actually have to catch narwhals in order to eat their skin to get enough vitamin C, right? And so this commandment of going out to spreading to all the world at the end of Noah's flood, where you now have major changes of climate, where you can't survive just by eating plants, is why it says in Genesis chapter 9, and I'm reading here, God blessed Noah and his sons, and he said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Verse 2, the fear of you and the dread of you shall be on every beast of the earth, on every bird of the air, on all that moves on the earth, and on all the fish of the sea. They are given into your hand. And then verse 3, it says, every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. I have given you all things, even as the green herbs. In other words, you can eat them just the same as I gave you plants in the beginning. Addendum, but you shall not eat the flesh with its life, that is, its blood. And there's a whole load of theological things we can go talking off to there. But if you want the point, this is a commandment given to the whole of humankind within a covenant which is still in effect today. We know that because God still hasn't flooded the world, just like he promised, right? We still have the commandment to go out and to fill the world. We still have the provision of being able to eat everything that moves except for the blood. And you know this because later on in the book of Acts, when the apostles were debating and deciding, well, which of the Jewish customs do we keep to the new Christians and so on and so forth, they went back to this original covenant that God had made with all of mankind at the end of the flood. So it's still in effect today, both under Old Testament and New Testament theology, I suppose you could say. So there is certainly an allowance to be able to eat meat, and in fact you have to do that in many parts of the world if you actually want to survive. So it was God's provision to us in order to do that.
Joe, did you mean vitamin C or vitamin D in the eating of narwhals?
I meant vitamin C, so the same as oranges and stuff, right? It was a very interesting documentary where I think it was a BBC one, Human Planet or something, but they were interviewing these different cultures from around the world, and I'd never really thought about that before. You know, where do you get vitamin C from? if you live in the Arctic and you don't have any fresh oranges or, your dark green cabbages and so on and so forth. And it basically turns out that once a year they hunt narwhals because the narwhals migrate up through the ice. So come the spring/summer when the ice begins to break up, the narwhals migrate in, I don't know, packs, herds, whatever you want to call them, through the ice, right, as they break open, and the hunters will hunt it, and they basically carve out the skin, hang it up to dry, and that provides vitamin C for them throughout the rest of the year. And I thought, well, thank you, Lord, that we can eat meat, because you wouldn't have anybody living up there unless you could get hold of your essential vitamins through narwhal skin. But there we go. Personally, I'd go for an orange, which is why I'm grateful for the supermarket. But you'll realise that even people living in Britain, if we are to rely purely off of stuff that we produced in this country, we'd still struggle to survive as a vegan here, because we just wouldn't get enough of our vitamins and energy and stuff that we need.
And the same is true for eating meat. You could have a warehouse full of red meat, particularly if it's from a wild animal, and die of starvation because you're not getting the right balance of foods, nutrients, vitamins, or fat, because wild animals just don't have much fat in them, and you've got to have some fat in your diet.
There's a lot of people now that are swearing by carnivore diets. I've got friends that are on carnivore diets. I think Jordan Peterson, the famous psychologist or whatever he is, his daughter talks about how she got over some pretty bad illnesses just by going on a carnivore diet, which does include things like eggs, I guess, and some other things. But I don't know what I think about that because of our biblical understanding, but perhaps it's speaking a little bit to maybe what some of the herbicides and additives to the crops that farmers are putting on and what it's doing to people's health.
I think it's also a sign as well of how far downhill we have gone as people, because having looked into a bit of the carnivore diet, because of some of my own health issues, not that I do it, I'm not saying that, but having looked into it, one of the comments is that it helps people who have autoimmune diseases. Now, that to me makes sense, because an autoimmune disease is your body effectively attacking itself, right? Particularly when you're consuming things that your body can't deal with. Now, if our bodies have gone downhill to the point where they can't even digest plants and get what we need out of plants anymore, now this is a separate issue from all the additives and artificial stuff that's in food nowadays. But even if your body is unable to deal with plants, that's not so much to say that we are evolving. That's not to say that we're getting better. That's not to say that even the plants have necessarily gone downhill. It's your body. And so you're turning to eat something which a different creature, a different body, if you like, has already done the job of turning the plants into something that is easier for your body to digest, as Diane said earlier, right? Now, that still may not necessarily be the most healthiest thing, and you may not be the most healthiest thing or body or person in the world, but that's more to do with just how downhill you have gone, rather than that being how we were meant to consume food, even before, even after the fall.
As someone who's also interested in hunting, when you look at some of the big cats and their prey, when they'll rip up an antelope or something like this, often they won't eat the antelope, they'll just rip its guts out and eat the contents of the guts, all the pre-digested vegetable material. They will certainly do that. And you say, what have they eaten? Well, they've eaten all the things they needed. They didn't need the rest of the meat because, talking about a non-vegan diet, they certainly get into their plant helps as they go. And the other thing too, having spent quite a bit of time wandering around the bush, there's certain tricks of the trade that you learn. And that is that if you're looking at cockatoos, don't necessarily drink out of the same pond they drank, don't necessarily eat the same food they did, because their stomachs can tolerate up to 40 or 50 times the amount of arsenic and some of those metallic poisons that you can. So therefore, I don't recommend you stew up the cockatoo either. But you better restrict yourself to pigeons and all those plant eaters. But there's quite a lot of things that their stomachs can cope with that our stomachs can no longer cope with, or perhaps we never were meant to in the beginning. We just don't know.
Good stuff. All right, we've just got a couple more quick questions to finish before we wrap stuff up. Little old me says, do people in the UK still make rat pie? Not to my knowledge, but Glenn, you and I both know somebody who's, well, I'm not sure it was a pie, but they've certainly eaten rat in the past. And I think you mentioned him a little bit earlier as well.
Yeah, Randy. And my wife ate some of it too. Of course, it was a Nutri-Rat, but it looks just like a rat. It's just huge.
Big
We
rat,
saw
yeah.
one when we were in the swamp.
We did, yeah.
Followed it swimming at night. I mean, these things, the tail alone will be that long. The body will be longer. And
just because we've been given permission to eat them doesn't mean that we have to eat them.
But, I've skinned one out, and it's some good-looking meat. And speaking for a person who loves squirrels that most people associate as well just tree rats, that is my favorite meat.
Yeah.
Squirrels.
Joe, when I was with you last, we stopped at a restaurant somewhere in the Midlands, and you could buy dead fly pie. What on earth is that about? It had lovely icing on it and lots of dead flies. It seemed to be sitting on the top of the icing.
Yeah. Where was that? That was Midlands way, wasn't it? It was. Yeah. I think it's like raisins or something, isn't it? Like those biscuits, dead fly biscuits in there, but they're like I think it's more because of the look rather than what they've put in it. Thankfully.
Oh, good. I was about to say I'll pass.
Yeah,
the British sense of humour, untranslatable. Great misses.
All right, we'll have one final question before we wrap stuff up and finish things off. It's an interesting one. I'm not sure we'll get to an actual answer, but it might spawn a bit of a discussion over biblical definitions. But anyway, it's from Shogiwa, which says, are crocodiles considered land animals or water creatures? Were they made on day 5 or were they made on day 6? What do we think?
That's a good question.
Frogs.
Yeah, they're sort of amphibious a bit. In fact, they can survive, from my knowledge, John, they can survive for quite a while washed out to sea.
Yeah.
So there's certainly the potential that they could survive the flood.
Well, we've seen freshwater crocodiles in our 2011 floods, which really badly affected Jurassic Ark. They found land crocodiles quite a large distance out to sea because they washed down out of the fresh water. Right now, the saltwater crocodiles are a different sort of group. They're not as dangerous as the freshwater crocodiles, but the freshwater crocodiles got washed out to sea and didn't seem to struggle with it at all. But their frogs, of course, can't cope with that. The frogs have to have water around to breed in. Usually it has to inevitably be fresh water. But I think, Shoggy War, you probably hit us with a baffling use of definition. We don't have a biblical definition of amphibious, do we, Joe or Glenn? Anybody know?
Not to my knowledge.
No. I would say, they need the land for reproducing. They bury their eggs. They get up to a certain temperature. So I would think it would be a land, but
But then so do sea turtles, and they live almost exclusively in the sea. So I think it's one of those things where you've got to remember that our own. We were to mention this earlier with some of Glenn's research into like dinosaur classification and stuff. Our definitions are not necessarily God's definitions, right? It was when we think about how we try and make sense of the world. It's certainly good to start with the scriptures and use that as a scaffolding going out, but we're not God, and so we're not always going to get to the same answer as God, and we need to make sure what we are classifying as doesn't necessarily contradict scripture. But there are some things like sea turtles and crocodiles and the like that we are just never going to get to a bottom answer of which day did God create that kind, And likewise, we're not going to get to questions about did they go on the ark or not necessarily, because that is a same definition that God used.
Well, perhaps I can throw in some of the complications that have come because the animal has actually changed its environment since creation. The ones I'm thinking of, the British were in the habit of leaving pigs everywhere, right? Because if a shipwreck occurred, then there'd be at least some food, goat or pigs. Now, leaving goats just cleaned up all the food on the island and the goats died. But in some places, they left pigs. and you can go and see those pigs today. They ran out of food on the island, and now they've taken up digesting food underneath the water. So you can see they're called diving pigs, and they'll actually swim around the sea, dive to the bottom, walk along the bottom, and harvest the bottom of the ocean floor. Now, is it amphibious? Well, no, it needs to go back to breathe. It needs to even come up and breathe. They've trained themselves like the Japanese pearl divers to breathe longer than they would normally with a mouthful of air, than longer than they would when they're out on the land. So there's some of those changes that will have applied to many of these creatures, and it makes it tough for us in a post-fall world because our brains are no longer as good as they used to be either. Shoggy, what we need to stand in front of the mirror, you and I, and say, I am no longer the perfect image of God. I'm a fallen creature. Help me, Lord.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Well, I think that's probably about time to bring Creation Conversations to an end. Remember, we will be back next week, same time as normal, as we have been for the last 3 years now. We've been doing this. So we will be back again next week, but then the following week, we will be changing things up a little bit because we will be going to an Australia-centric time. It will be on a Tuesday evening, for Australians, that is, which is sort of a Tuesday morning for us here in the UK, and a very, very early Tuesday morning for the United States. So if you fancy getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning in the USA, then please do. But don't worry, even though it will be hard for you to catch us live going forward, we will be changing things around again in the future, where we are adopting a hybrid system, and we will still be doing live streams which are suitable for different places around the world. And watch out for any updates about that as we go. Well, it's time to bring everything to a close and to finish off. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for all your interaction today. We do appreciate it. Do continue to like and subscribe and share the content around. We put a lot of effort not just into the live streams, but also into the daily videos that go out, as well as the road trips and many other things. We've got some big plans going forward, not just with Creation Conversations, but also with the future of the media channel, as well as Creation Research Live and everything else. But until next week, where we'll be back at the same time, same place, goodbye, God bless, and we will see you very soon. Catch you later, everybody.